You're listening to Conversations in Atlantic Theory, a podcast dedicated to books and ideas generated from and about the Atlantic world. In collaboration with the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, these conversations explore the cultural, political, and philosophical traditions of the Atlantic world, ranging from European critical theory to the Black Atlantic to sites of indigenous resistance and self-articulation, as well as the complex geography of thinking between traditions, inside traditions, and from positions of insurgency, critique, and counter-narrative. Today's discussion is with three scholars of Frantz Fanon's work and legacy. First, Rose Ferreira da Silva, professor at State University of Bahia in Brazil, who writes on race, politics, Afro-Brazilian literature, and comparative ethnic and African studies. She's joined by Lou Turner, who teaches Black political thought and its radical iterations in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, Illinois. As well, we're joined by Nigel Gibson, who teaches in the Institute of Interdisciplinary Studies at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts. Nigel is the author and editor of numerous articles and book-length treatments of Fanon's work, including the work we are discussing here, Fanon Today, Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth, published by Daraja Press in 2021. Hello, Nigel, Rose, and Lou. Great to have you here. How are you all doing?
Good.
Thank you.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Hi, I'm okay.
Yeah,
so it's
thanks
good to
for inviting us.
It's good to see you in virtual space, but mostly to hear, since this is a podcast. It will be our audio. So first of all, I'm really excited to talk about this book and hear your reflections on the work of the project in general, about Fanon's work generally and broadly, but also some specific themes across the text. It's not only, I think, a really timely and exciting volume, but it's really hefty. This is like a very serious contribution. Just there are lots of pages and lots of words on the page. And I mean that in the best sense. It really, the scope of the volume in terms of its ideas ambition is really matched by the size of the reflections and the length of the pieces, and just the sheer volume of ideas is really impressive. And I have to say, to you, Nigel, as editor, I know this editing work can be really thankless, and contributors are always very thankful, but in the profession, we're not always the most thankful about it. But I really appreciate all that editorial work. It must have been an enormous task, but it is, for us as readers, it's absolutely valuable. So, maybe to start, I wanted to ask this, to you, Nigel, as the editor, but also to Rose and Lou, perhaps some reflections that you have as contributors to the collection. I want to ask a sort of broad question of to invite you to narrate your way into the project. I'm thinking, you, Nigel, as the editor, as I was saying, this is a hefty project, and you take on a lot of time and energy and resources to produce it. And, what drew you to it? What drew you to invest that kind of human effort and time and energy into it?
Well, thank you. Thanks for having us on. And thanks for noting the enormous amount of work, the labor of love, as Jane Gordon calls it. The project emerged out of the idea of my 2011 book, which was actually published on the 50th anniversary of Fanon's death and Les Dames de Terre, which was called Fanonian Practices in South Africa, from Steve Biko to Abathilali Basmanjondolo. And interestingly, critics had no problem with Biko as a Fanonian practitioner, but they quickly dismissed my conception of the shack dweller movement, Abathilali, as Fanonian, and they dismissed it as romantic. The idea that the excluded and the damned of post-apartheid society could not only organize themselves, but think from their own collective experiences was not something that was acceptable.
Interesting.
So I was hoping at the time that others, Fanonian practices in South Africa, others could write Fanonian practices from other locations. And in a sense, this collection is an iteration of that. But also, the book was movement-centered rather than academic-centered.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, expressed in the subtitle, which is The Reason and Revolt of the Wretched of the Earth. The thinking and reflection that's done in movements and communities, often thought to be very much on the margins or even outside of political and social discourse.
Mm-hmm.
And so the birth of the movement, it took a couple of years to put this together, and the idea was developed in 2019, and one of the sort of elements of that was Hassan Mazzin's film Fanon, Yesterday and Today, and it's a two-part film. The first part's on yesterday, Fanon's life, and then the today part is his interviews with activists around the world, and the chapters, some of the interviews in that book became the chapters in this book. For example, the one on the Black experience in Portugal and the one on Fanon in Palestine. But the project really got going in 2020, just before the pandemic shutdowns. I was in South Africa and met with Abbas Lali in Durban and to discuss Fanon. And the idea was and this was an original idea of the book, was to sort of have interviews with, or not interviews, but have movements from below, discussions with movements, community movements, activist movements, and so forth. And so I discussed Fanon with them in Durban, and then that became a chapter in this book. But then as the pandemic hit and time went on, the whole idea of doing a 60th anniversary meant, it got expanded amazingly into 22 chapters, but that didn't exhaust its possible scope. And there were a number of other chapters. Of course, when you edit a book, you're always looking, you always have more people say they're going to do it than in the end can do it within the deadline. The third element of it, which was essential to it, in a certain sense, was the work of Rosemere at Daraja Press. I mean, he's done an enormous amount. This is not a profit-making press; it's a movement press, and he did an enormous amount of work, editorial work as well as just organizing work. And why I wanted to go with Daraja Press was because they, make the PDF available for anybody, just by them, through signing into Daraja Press. So that was an essential element. The point was, like, why are we writing books? I mean, if activists and community people in struggling communities and whatnot, and activists and intellectuals in movements can't afford to buy books, then who are we writing them for? So I wanted that to be, I wanted it to be available, even if only as a PDF. So that in a certain sense, that also was a Fanonian practice, to make these books available to people in the grassroots movements.
Yeah. So, I mean, I just have to say, as a side note, this podcast series is in collaboration with Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, which is a philosophical and theoretical journal. So it has a different aspiration than the kind you're specifically speaking to. But we are an open access journal because of the professor, the scholar and student iteration of that, which is making these materials available to whoever has the capacity to download a PDF. And it's interesting, the academic politics of that kind of publishing. I know moving the journal to open access was an entire existential event. People didn't want to do it, but the political meaning of it is so important. And I think, just what you underscored in terms of this volume, the way it engages so many geographies in terms of concrete political movements, making this text available Thank you for that choice. I mean, I would love to see that from more scholars going forward. Um, and let me ask, Lou and Rose, ask you as contributors, what drew you to the volume? We're all, writers, teachers, humans, friends, family members, etc. So we also take out time. What drew you we'll have a chance to talk about the content of your particular contributions, but what intrigued you or attracted you to this particular volume? Maybe Lou, start.
Well, I came to the project as Nigel knows. We've known each other for decades now. I come to the project very much from the framework that Nigel sketched out for you for this project, and that I
Mhm.
co-authored a work called Frantz Fanon, Soweto, and American Black Thought, which was the creation of a booklet or a pamphlet for movement. It was a Marxist humanist um, pamphlet and reading of Fanon and the social movement of the time that we started writing in 1975. And in the course of writing it over 1976, Soweto happened and the emergence of
Mhm.
the Black consciousness movement and the revelation that one of its leaders, Steve Biko, had been reading Fanon, a somewhat different Fanon than we had read back in the Black Power movement in the 1970s, late 1960s, 1970s in the United States, where we
Mhm.
were all reading Wretched of the Earth. Biko and his comrades were reading Black Skin, White Mass and the development of Black consciousness as a revolutionary category, which is pretty much at the center of perhaps the most contentious word in the subtitle of Nigel's book. And that's the word reason,
Mhm.
not just the revolt of the wretched of the earth, but the reason of the wretched of the earth. And the term comes from Fanon himself. And so Biko and the Black consciousness movement have made self consciousness a revolutionary category. And we knew a little bit of something about that in the Black Power movement, which was a Black consciousness movement itself in the United States.
Mhm.
So I had written a pamphlet, a movement pamphlet, which I'm proud to say circulated in the underground in South Africa amongst revolutionary youth and activists. And
Mhm.
so the idea that Nigel approached me with about creating this work, um, as it turns out, on a much larger scale in terms of the scope of the volume, but I think was perfect because we always viewed Fanon as a world revolutionary.
Mhm.
Um, it, I thought that this was kind of like a new iteration of what we had done with our pamphlet back in 1978 when we published it,
Mhm.
both in terms of the artwork and the graphics, which I think are important, the photography inside and capturing social movements, but also the analysis and the voices that we wanted represented uh, to
Yeah.
to demonstrate the reason of the revolt of the wretched of the earth. So I came to it with that perspective. I thought it was a kind of a high wire act that Nigel was walking, however, to
That for
produce
sure.
a book of what 600 or almost 600 pages
It's
as
the
a
world's largest pamphlet.
yeah, there's the world's largest pamphlet, but it also works in the sense of
Yeah.
the availability, and I think this is something that's worth much more discussion within the movement and the intersection of the movement with academia, and that is the role. And this again, Fanon speaks to this in Dying Colonialism, a work that isn't studied or discussed enough. It's the role of technology at this stage in
Mm.
relationship to social movements. He had a famous chapter in Dying Colonialism about the radio, the tech and
Mhm.
technology in the movement.
Yeah.
And what you're doing at your shop, and what Nigel was doing, having a PDF and doing with Daraja Press, you know what we saw with Arab Spring and the role of social media in that movement and other movements. What we see with the George Floyd Black Lives Matter and the iPhone and the media. I think there has to be a much more serious discussion than we've had so far, at least so far as I know. Maybe there are going some ones about the new role of technology in social movements, which would make
Yeah.
a text with the scope of Nigel's text um, not outside the purview of social movements at all. A PDF is now available; you can get it. Um, and those technologies have a tremendous impact and I think speed up the revolutionary process that we're in.
And I think what you're underscoring there is really just how, this kind of text, and hopefully others to come like it, is also a challenge to scholars to,
Right.
I think that, scholars, in my experience, tend towards the conservative, if not politically, certainly around the culture of publication.
Mm.
And the idea of mass circulation and availability is something that actually causes a lot of anxiety.
Mm.
But exactly what you're saying, I really love the way you put that. It gives us chance to say, the political imperatives that may be in your work, right, actually land differently if they pop up on somebody's iPhone
Well, John, the thing
in
is
any part of the world.
that's interesting is that the technology allows for a democratization of ideas. And if anything, academia is supposed to be about
Yeah.
that. And
Well,
so,
I will just say anecdotally, I would never name who it was, but one of the objections when we moved what used to be the Journal of French Philosophy, changed its name to French. I wanted Journal of Francophone Philosophy, but we compromised French and Francophone philosophy. One of the objections that got a lot of applause was this phrase. I remember some kid in his underwear in his basement will be reading our stuff. And I was like, don't we all read in our underwear, first of all? And second of all, if there's some teenager reading something about Francophone theory, let's run towards that.
that's right.
So, Rose, what drew you to make your contribution to this collection, which, again, we'll have a chance to talk about. I really loved your essay. I learned a ton from it. So, but the content of the essay aside, I'm curious how you were drawn to contribute to this.
Well, I've been researching on Black intellectuals for a few years. And when I was doing my master's at Federal University of Bahia, so I started discipline with a professor. Her name is Florentina da Silva Souza. And Florentina introduced Fanon's idea in her classes, especially talking about black skin, white mask. So at that time, I decided to research on a Black intellectual in Sergipe, the state where I live. I'm from Rio de Janeiro, but I live in Sergipe, the northeast of Brazil. Ferreira da Silva is a Black intellectual in Sergipe, and he's from Black movements in Sergipe. And he writes poetry, novels, so because I'm from literature. And I was that time researching in his cultural production. And it was so interesting how I found it, the way that Severo da Silva promoted some interventions in the state, especially in the capital of the state, that is Aracaju, where I live. So after that, I was trying to understand his trajectory as a Black man, as a Black intellectual, and of course, the kind of literature he was thinking about, and the kind of combination of his literature and the way he was thinking about Sergipe, the society in Sergipe, and of course, Brazilian society, and the problem of being Black in Brazilian society. Well, when I finished my master's course, I started the doctoral studies, and I decided to continue investigating the way of Black thinkers they produce their projects. So then I decided to research on two big figures in Brazil. Abdias do Nascimento and Milton Santos. Abdias do Nascimento, he was an activist. He was a famous activist, and his thoughts were very important for Brazilian people to discuss and understand our participation as Black people in Brazilian society. So, and Milton Santos, he was a geographer, a famous geographer, and I had a particular interest in analyzing the trajectory of Abdias as an activist and the trajectory as Milton Santos as an academic. So it was very important to write a thesis about Abdias and Milton Santos. And then my project continues because when I decided to go to the United States to work with Professor Louis Gordon, so it was much more interesting because then I really decided to read Fanon and read more in a deep way. So I had a project at that time in 2009 in interviewing some Black people, the archivals of the discussion of Black studies in the U.S. So I interviewed a bunch of people and from different fields in literature, in philosophy, in anthropology, in sociology. And so it was hard work. And so then I have the interviews and so all the material we are organizing just because I don't want to just publish the interviews, but I would like to have kind of the first part of the book explaining how the interviews, they are connected. So Fanon is very important to Brazilians and very important in literature because today I cannot understand my work or I cannot understand writing a book, even in poetry, not fiction, and without thinking about Fanon's idea and how I'm going to explain to students or how I'm going to think about the way that Fanon discussed the colonial situation and how the colonial situation and the intervention of the colonial practice could impact on the way that Black people we think and the way that we are, especially in Brazil when we talk about branqueamento. So until today, people in Brazil, we have problems and became more white and not really understanding our responsibility as Blacks, especially when we are talking about in a political way and towards a transformative, pursuing a transformative situation. Yeah, I think to be short is the idea.
Yeah. So, and maybe if I could follow up, and this would be a question I would love to hear you all reflect a little bit on, the volume obviously is focused on the Wretched of the Earth in terms of its title and the content, right? As a political document, a transnational political document. But, I was thinking, especially listening to you talk just now, Rose, in terms of race, racialization, colonialism, and so forth, that also resonates really deeply with Black Skin, White Masks. Right?
Sure.
And so I'm curious how, in thinking about Fanon for you, Rose, and then also Lou as a contributor, but then Nigel as editor, but also writer, what is it about the Wretched of the Earth that seems a bigger draw than like a bolder draw than Black Skin, White Masks for the kind of work that you're doing in this in this volume? Or is it really, or do you really feel a different draw with Wretched of the Earth? I mean, or are they both? And I'm thinking also of Lou's comment about Biko and Black consciousness, being so deeply connected to something like Black Skin, White Masks. But Rose, maybe start us off with the thought.
Well, when I decided to, because I was investigating the trajectory of Black intellectuals, and especially talking about Black men. And of course, when I went to a Congress and a person asked me, why not investigating the trajectories of Black women, and, you know, and why you are not investigating the trajectories of Black women and writing about Black women. So then I was thinking, and I was just researching on some names that could be interesting for the historiography in Brazil. And so then I the name of Neuza Souza Santos and Laila Gonzalez and others, of course, but I'm just specifically talking about the two, both of them. So they pop up. And it was so interesting because I found that both of them had a strong influence of Frantz Fanon's idea in their writings. In Brazil, I would say that people usually know more about blacks in white masks, and
Interesting.
I think the book is more available, and The Scratch of the Earth is not really available because we have the translations in Portuguese. But I think Brazilian people are more familiar with Black Skin, White Mask. But I think the two books, they completed kind of combination, because all the time when I'm writing about my essays and articles, if I'm going to talk about Black Skin, White Mask, I will just use something from The Scratch of the Earth. So I think it's quite not, it's important to have a kind of combination in terms of ideas.
Yeah.
So yeah.
John, I'm dying to ask this question or raise this point, and it just struck me because this conversation has created a conjuncture of something that I think we should not miss, particularly if we're thinking about what this year is the whatever anniversary of Black Skin, White Mask. This is for Rose. As an adolescent, and I'm sorry, this is personal, but it's as an adolescent, my first love affair as a young man was with Marpessa Dawn, who was the lead actress in the Brazilian film Black Orpheus. This relates to French and Francophone philosophy because Jean-Paul Sartre's famous essay for negritude poetry, which Fanon engages as well as critiques in Black Skin, White Mask, was entitled Black Orpheus. And that trope has traveled. A number of people have used Black Orpheus. But then there's the Brazilian film, Black Orpheus. And it's the most impactful film of my youth, I would say. And that's not 2020 hindsight. That was at the time. It was just a stunning film. And I saw it in black and white. I wonder what it would ever look like in color. But it was of Black Brazilian culture. And I mean, it's just an incredible film. And I've never thought until this conversation, what would it be like to look at that film in terms of Black Brazilian culture and Frantz Fanon and Jean-Paul Sartre, for that matter. I mean, why did he call his essay Black Orpheus? And then the connection, of course, is that Fanon asked Sartre to write the preface to Wretched of the Earth, which some Sartrean scholars, and I'd be one, who would say that it was his most revolutionary writing. But I just coming together here, I said
it's kind of the only Sartre I like, to be honest.
But here it is. I mean, what an interesting conjuncture between the two of Brazil, and it's a very important trope. Black Orpheus. And it meant something in Fanon. It has this connection to Black Brazilian culture that was unique at the time when that was made, and it was global. I mean, it came to it was part of, Black arts and Black culture at the time. So
Well, Brazil is a huge country and full of contradictions, right? So black orphans, and so of course you can see a black culture in the film, and you can identify that the film is talking about a diversity of how black culture, we understand black culture in the country. In Brazil, it's another contradiction that Fanon's book, The Scratched of the Earth, is not really. The book is well known because of the foreword of Sartre. So yeah, and people usually read more the foreword than the book itself. So yeah, and the point is that sometimes the idea that we have is we are living in a reality that is not really, we are talking about a reality that is really different from the reality that we live. But anyway, I think the contradictions of Black Brazil, it's a contradiction that is about more than 50% of the population, but all the time to understand and to fight against a word that all the time is deny our existence is just like really difficult for all of us. And yeah, and it's so interesting because until today in some universities and schools, Fanon's reading are not really popular. So people from the Black movements, they read more Fanon. They much more aware about the Fanon's idea and how to understand his ideas are working in terms of discussing of racialization in Brazil.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, it would be great to actually put together a collection on Fanon, Césaire, Sartre, and the film, because I mean, it strikes me as a film Césaire must have loved if he ever came across it. But Nigel, how about for you? You know, what was behind your choice to move Wretched of the Earth to the center of the collection? Rather than sort of Fanon generally or Black Skin, White Masks. I mean, I think I have an intuition of why, but I'm curious about that choice for you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question because I hadn't actually thought about it in that way. I mean, I don't really see a contradiction between the Fanon of Black Skin, White Masks and the Fanon of the Wretched of the Earth, although there are certainly contradictions and developments in his thought. And so there are many articles in or chapters in the book that engage Black Skin, White Masks, like Roses, which again has these Black intellectuals who are also part of movements, like and also or Lou's piece, which is the same. The intellectuals are part of the this is part of the Black Power moment, so to speak, or Black Power movement. So, or for example, or a much more personal story, the opening chapter, which is Flavio's chapter which is really mostly on the importance of Black Skin, White Masks to his own conception of the particular lived experience of the Black in Portugal. But why? So why was it going to be Le Damned de Terre? Well, one reason was it was going to be the 60th anniversary. So
Yeah.
and this was an idea that I had. It started in 2019. I thought, I should do this for the 60th anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
And second, because of my own work coming back to Fanonian practices in South Africa and the way in which the Wretched of the Earth had been so important to generations of African revolutionaries on the
Mm-hmm.
continent, and also, of course, in the US. And my
Yeah.
own introduction to, you know, to Fanon was through the Wretched of the Earth, and you know, so in a certain sense, you know, what Ayez Malik calls the immediacy of Fanon in Pakistan, his chapter, is really about the way in which you can read the Wretched, you know, in the post-independence, post-colonial, quote unquote, situation of Pakistan, or the post-apartheid situation in South Africa, or the post-colonial Kenya, or Ghana, and so forth. You can read The Wretched of the Earth and see a certain immediacy in what Fanon describes. And this takes me back to my a kind of lecture I gave, not kind of, a lecture I gave in Durban in 2004 on Fanon. And students were just beginning to read, were reading Fanon. It wasn't really high, it wasn't hugely popular in South Africa at all. But they were reading Fanon and basically finding that they could just put in names of local leaders or local politicians or local entrepreneurs in place of when Fanon talks about, the national bourgeoisie
Yeah.
and so forth. I mean, it directly kind of connected to them. So there's a kind of immediacy of Fanon, which I
So,
thought was, it's particularly for new readers of Fanon. That's particularly alluring. But of course,
mhm.
it's much wider than that.
So thinking of that immediacy, let me pose this question, and I'm curious what each of you has to say about this. I mean, one of the things that's really remarkable about the volume, just even a glance at the table of contents, is the incredible geography that's covered in the collection. So many different conflicts, so many different post-colonial situations, different nations, different languages, and different colonial histories. The colonial history of Pakistan is so different than the settler colonialism of South Africa or of Algeria or Martinique. So the diversity is not just different places on the map, but also diverse times, some historical, right? I'm thinking of number of essays that sort of trace Fanon's influences through, prior movements. Lou, your essay comes to mind for sure. But also just the real diversity of the kinds of experiences of colonialism, that not all colonial experiences are the same, right? There's a difference between, settler and administration from abroad, the sort of special place, say, of India in the British imagination of colonialism, and Algeria for the French, and so on. But what's remarkable about the volume is that it is testimony to, or certainly wants to be testimony to, Fanon's ability to travel across time and travel across geography, travel across Earth, right? The globe in terms of the existential experience of politics, so it's not just, plugging in terminology, because when you were saying that, they could swap out these categories of bourgeois, intellectual, this is this person. It's not just, of course, what you were saying is not just a swap out, right? It's not just a kind of bland application. It's a depth experience. And so I'm curious, how do you, how do you have in some sort of, I don't want to say concise, but in some sort of, sort of lasered kind of way, what is it about Fanon that allows this to be a story about Palestine or South Africa or the Caribbean or the US and all of those other countries that one could plug in? So maybe Lou, sort of first comment on that.
I think two things. Just the bottom line, Fanon, I think without fear of being of any contradiction on this, Fanon's texts are subversive texts, and I think certainly French and Francophone philosophy would understand that. I think they kind of specialize in he's thinking they create subversive texts that upend or deconstruct the established quo and the status quo. And Fanon's constant reemergence on the global stage, constant reemergence on the global stage at periods of revolutionary upsurge or pre-revolutionary upsurge in some cases, um, speak to his texts being subversive. And each he kind of prophesied it himself in his the famous statement that everybody likes to repeat from the chapter on national culture in Wretched of the Earth. Each generation must out of relative obscurity discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. And we just see that over and over. That resonates with each new generation because they want to subvert the establishment, the status quo. And his texts are texts that they view, um, whether or not they've internalized it or whatnot. But that's the name. That's the story. I have a book that came out, edited volume on Fanon's psychotherapeutic practices, and one of the people we interviewed was a radio personality here in Champaign, Urbana, who had a radio program around mental health and psychological health of people, and it was from a Fanonian perspective. I was on the program many times, and when we did the interview for our book with her, and she had been as a child part of the Black Panthers. She was a young Panther, the breakfast program, and we said, "So, what attracted you to Fanon?" She says, "Just the idea and the identity of being a revolutionary. That was it. As for a young person, it was that he was a revolutionary. To read him is to construct an identity for oneself as a revolutionary." And I think I see that over and over. You see Fanon all over public art, within the whole George Floyd, Black Lives Matter moment, all over the country, uh, with the famous statement, which actually goes back to the Eric Garner strangulation in Long Island, New York, where Eric Garner says, I can't breathe." And
Yeah.
George Floyd says the same thing um, on in video. And "I can't breathe." And then the famous quote from Black Skin, White Mass. It wasn't from Wretched of the Earth, it was from Black Skin, White Mass. "We revolt not because of any particular culture, but simply because we can no longer breathe." And this went
Hmm.
viral on social media um, during the Eric Garner and again during the George Floyd, um, uh, essentially public lynching. Um, and so Fanon is a subversive text. And second point, I'd say, and I guess partly a question for Nigel, I just forget the sequence of him editing the book and the anniversary of the Paris Commune, which was 1871, and the title, "The Wretched of the Earth," coming from the Internationale, the song of the revolutionary socialist movement. "Arise, ye prisoners of starvation, arise, ye the wretched of the earth."
Hmm.
And the person that wrote it was part of the Paris Commune. Um, and so I was wondering if that also played a role in the focus of "Wretched of the Earth" for the volume that Nigel edited.
Yeah, Nigel, what do you?
Well, I mean that's a great point, and in fact, um, that's the first page of my introduction. I begin with the Commune and Eugene Potier's song, and then refer it to Jacques Roman. Yeah, 150 years since the Commune. I think it's a great point, um, and probably if not consciously, then unconsciously, I've just forgotten many things, and that might have been one of the things. One of the things I forgot as part of its anniversary.
Rose, if I could ask, I know you wanted to respond to this, and I wanted to ask you maybe even just specifically in terms of your essay, if that's okay. Or did you want to speak to the commune?
I would like to add something. I think
Sure.
Fanon is a kind of revolutionary thinker that he is all the time teaching us how to be revolutionary.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great point when we read Fanon. It's interesting how the idea of being revolutionary is the idea that you need to understand what are your aims and objectives when you were talking about you as a human being. And another thing that I would like to say is how Fanon's idea are interpreted and reinterpreted in different spaces. In America, in Latin America, in Brazil, or in Europe, or in the US, or in different spaces, in different countries. And how we understand Fanon's idea outside of institutions. We understand Fanon's ideas in different places that are not really recognized as educational institutions. But they are teaching us all the time, as, for example, the Black movement in Brazil. So for a long period, Neuza Souza Santos and Lélia Gonzalez, the two figures that I'm talking about in the essay, they were part of the Black movement in Rio, and they encountered Fanon in that space, and how they were not in get in touch with the Fanon's readings in an educational space, and how the space of the movements, they are forming people intellectually. So, and how the understanding in this way is the understanding, Fanon's ideas in this way is the understanding how to be revolutionary. To be revolutionary is to fight against a word that all the time is denying the existence of Black people. So, and how institutions, educational institutions, are not teaching what the movements are teaching, and that's why maybe Fanon is until today so revolutionary.
And that makes both what you just said now, Rose, and what Lou was saying just before, does open up this really interesting question about what would it mean to talk about Fanon's ontology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if one thinks about on Fanon's ontology, I mean, myself, my immediate go-to is, the construction of blackness by the white gaze in Black Skin, White Masks, and the new humanism in Wretched of the Earth, and the way those two sort of expand across the work between those two books, but also, are present in both. But this idea of being a revolutionary, right? A kind of being is, for me, a really interesting way to just formulate, what is his ontology? It's an ontology of transformation, but it doesn't leap immediately to the new humanism, right? It's this becoming revolutionary as a mode of being.
I think if we could make it contemporary, and again in the connection between Brazil and South Africa, that today we see the shack dwellers of Baswali creating a commune in some of those spaces that they've created, self-consciously calling themselves a commune. And one of them has a commune where there is a Fanon Center. But they also say that they're in conversation with and drawing ideas from the movement in Brazil,
Hmm.
very consciously so. And so the
Interesting.
idea that Fanon's ontology can be one that bridges or undergirds this transnationalism of ideas of going not just to revolution, but beyond revolution to what happens after the revolution. That
Yeah.
is the creation of a new society within the breakup of the old, which is the dialectic. That
Yeah.
is, you don't just get rid of something one day and then magically have something the next day. There's a gestation. It's a growing within the old of something new. And the idea of a commune, that these shack dwellers that are creating these communes in certain of townships in South Africa, and that they're drawing inspiration and they're having these conversations with similar movements in Brazil, and they're and they have a Fanon Center, at least at one of them, is just fascinating. I mean, we're at a
Yeah.
different stage of thinking about social movements that many of us were part of in the past, but we always had these connections internationally. I don't want to say that that's new,
Hmm.
but where they're taking it now, and at least using Fanon, at least in some instance, as a philosophical basis for what they're doing, is
Hmm.
incredibly exciting and is new. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
really anxious when I get rid of some of these other damn projects I'm working on to really dig into what is happening with this
Yeah.
between South Africa and Brazil.
Hmm. So,
I
uh,
just want to I
so
just want to say something about the cover. John, I don't know whether you actually got a hard copy of the book or whether the PDF I sent you actually had the cover of the book. Um,
I've
but
seen the cover, and it'll be on the detail part of the podcast. But yeah,
oh,
go
great,
ahead and speak
great. I
to
mean,
it.
there was real, real thought and intention in this. First of all, the Fanon picture of Fanon and the red sun comes from a South African artist, Anastasia Ilisiva. And then, but the thing is, but then when I first saw it, I thought, I really liked it. I liked the color of it, but it was very static. Um, the people on the bottom, who are actually some of the shack dwellers in a movement photo, um, weren't they weren't there. So in fact, it was like lines and so forth. So, but to have that relationship between, there's Fanon, the red sun, but then there's action. In other words, there's a kind of there's a certain sense of movement or flow in
Hmm.
in the in the cover. And so, and I just appreciate Lou talking about interestingly, I think, and this certainly happened after I was, after the book was underway, was that what the shack dwellers created on this occupied piece of land. In other words, under threat from forced removal and so forth, is the Fanon School. They named it. They had the Steve Biko Center and they have the Fanon School. And I reproduce a photograph of it in the introduction. But the third thing I want to say, in terms of this kind of global movement or exchange, is that also is talk about Ireland for a moment. In other words, here's the question of the question of the Irish language as actually essential to the crisis in the north of Ireland at this very moment. In other words, the fact that the DUP, the Unionist DUP party, who were the majority party, tried to defund the Irish language programs, created a backlash and social movement by Irish language activists, of whom one of them is Fergal McInnerty, who writes this chapter about Fanon, the importance of Fanon to the Irish language struggle, which he then in the chapter connects back to the internment of Republicans in the late 19. This in fact being 50 years after Bloody Sunday.
Sunday, right.
The last week, the internment of Republicans in the late 60s and early 70s decided to learn Irish, but also were reading at that very moment The Wretched of the Earth. Now, I know that Homi Bhabha mentions this in his introduction, but it had very, very little to do with the question of violence. In other words, the IRA already knew about violence, and they were engaging in an armed struggle. They didn't need to be convinced about violence, but they were interested in other questions, and especially on the question of national culture and language that were being brought up. Not only, they may have not been reading Black Skin, White Mask, but of course the question of language comes up there right at the beginning, talking about ontology, for example, and the question of language in the chapter on national culture in The Wretched of the Earth. So it's fascinating that you talked about the traveling and the contemporaneity of Fanon. Here we have contemporary Ireland today, right? Where the fact that the whole question of Brexit and the way it's moving and the way it's working out in the Northern Ireland, and in fact the crisis of the British state turns on this question of the Irish language as a mass movement threatening the stability of the north of Ireland, and of course Britain as a whole in terms of the Brexit and Europe and whatnot. So it's just like, in other words, Fanon is coming up, and here's a connection. And fascinating thing for me is, in fact, Fergal. I met Fergal in France in 2000, I think in 2012, in a conference on Fanon. He'd just written his dissertation on the Irish language struggle, historical kind of struggle, which he repeats some of it here in this chapter. But so these are also the connections. There are people doing. In other words, I wouldn't have known about Fergal McEnroe if I hadn't met him. And I wouldn't have known this element of the way in which someone's using Fanon and has this connection back to, his father was interned, so he has a personal connection to people, actually, to Irish Republican prisoners. Very, very many of them working class, people who didn't finish school, engaging in learning Irish language and also reading about Fanon as they were interned in the 1970s, and of course, and that becoming part of a new kind of a new movement of the way in which language is political. In other words, to learn Irish became a political element, which of course we understand Fanon. Just to think about Wretched of the Earth for 1 second. The Wretched of the Earth is remarkable in that it wasn't the book Fanon wanted to write. He had this much grander project of writing a book about a continental liberation from the Cape to Algiers, right? That was the title I think in 1960 of the book he wanted to write. In the end, during a moment of remission from leukemia, he was able to write The Wretched of the Earth. Took him, he was able to put it together, some of the parts were already written. He was able to put it together. And now, 60 years later, we're still reading a book that he had to put together as he was dying. And he concluded it with a chapter on mental health. So he saw the importance of mental health, not only in the struggle against colonialism, but for what would happen after. In other words, after independence, he made it very clear in that struggle on mental health that the questions that he was raising throughout the book wouldn't be just sorted out automatically. There was no magic, machine, as he says elsewhere, that would liberate people, or in a certain way liberate people from the trauma and mental health issues that came out of the colonial war and out of colonization. He
So
left.
It's
Go
crazy
ahead.
to think about these. You mentioned him composing this book. In a period of remission. I just think of all of these. George Jackson writing from just absolutely horrifying prison conditions, or just the way early phenomenologies. A lot of it was written, and even early Wittgenstein. Written from bombed out ruins or trenches. And it's a little bit shameful then in those moments to complain about productivity under a pandemic where we all have our books here. They're just trapped inside. But
There's a small footnote to Nigel's. I'm surprised he didn't bring it up, but the English translation of "Wretched of the Earth" was by an Irish national activist.
Yeah. So, Rose, I want to come back to this sort of Fanon's capacity to travel and the way that plays out in your essay in particular, because one of the things that struck me when I was reading through it is, of course, Latin America and the Caribbean have just been, since the Second World War, have had so much intellectual production around anti and post-colonial theory, around national literature, around race and racism. And so Fanon having the impact that you talked about in your essay is, it's just, a thinker who has big impact is worth talking about and is noteworthy. But I was just thinking about Fanon is not one of the only intellectuals in the hemisphere to speak to these issues, right? But you really talk in your essay about the immensity of his impact. And so in that way of, what is it about Fanon that travels well to different geographies? I wondered, in terms of your essay, what elements of Fanon's work in particular you think allowed him to have such a sizable impact in a context where there is so much intellectual production, that sort of, I don't want to say battling because it's not an actual battle, but is, it takes a lot to emerge as an important figure in the context you're writing about. What is it about Fanon that makes him stand out in that context?
First of all, I'd like to say something about language.
Oh yeah, please.
That's interesting, because when you're talking about to be global ideas, and how is interesting for you to be global, the language that you are gonna write about it. And I would like to say that we have, of course, lots of things in Brazil in terms of intellectual production, but Brazil is a huge country that, from the Oiapoque until Chuí, we all Brazilians, we speak one language, and we speak Portuguese. And so how is interesting for you to be global that you need to speak another language and you need to write in another language, and how language is for you to your ideas travel around the world. You need to communicate sometimes in different languages, and the way of you think sometimes in your own language is really different when you think about in a foreign language, for example. And I'm saying that because I wrote the article in Portuguese and the article was translated into English. And the way sometimes that we write in our language is a different way that the translation is gonna organize. And it was an interesting work between me and Jane Anna Gordon, and how we thought just to proceed the translation of the article. And it was interesting because I wrote in Portuguese and then I translated first into English, and then we discussed how to organize the prose in a way that the article could be interesting to read. And it's interesting because Jane, she doesn't know much about Portuguese, but the work was so interesting because she knows the way that I write. And so it helped a lot how we organize all the ideas. It's just to complete the idea of language and to be global. Well, in Brazil, when in 1960, when Sartre came to Brazil, so we had some intellectuals in Brazil thinking about Fanon, but we also have those intellectuals go to the exile during the dictatorship in Brazil. So, and for most of them, Ottaviani, Abdias Nascimento, Clóvis Moura, and others, they encountered Fanon during the exile and during the dictatorship in Brazil. So, and when they came back to Brazil after the dictatorship, they brought even Paulo Freire, right? Even Paulo Freire, the great thinker in education in Brazil. So his ideas was most of his ideas were based in Fanon's idea. And so when they came back to Brazil after the dictatorship, so the logic of using Fanon in the spaces where they used it to work was there was no sense because of the idea of the educational procedures and practice in Brazil not really had a connection at that time with Fanon's idea. So from that from this moment that we are working, so everything is different because, of course, we had a lot of people from different places, from different movements in Brazil, go into some spaces, especially in academic spaces, to discuss Fanon. And then Fanon is just interesting in this context because his ideas are, it's interesting how in literature, for example, we can use his ideas to discuss different tasks in literature. And so I'm writing now an essay about another book named Torturado, and how the community in the narrative that is a specific part of Brazil, that is Chapada Diamantina in Bahia. So they understand in the narratives as Black people. And how, for example, the land is in a specific way of understand themselves as human and Black people. And how, because the narrative is about 45 years after the abolition in Brazil, and how the idea of exploration is really in the narrative. And so we could not understand the narrative without understanding how the racialization, how the idea of a racialization of Black people is posted on Brazilian society.
So, Lou, let me ask you about your essay. A sort of similar question. You know, you make such interesting, give such an interesting history, and I have to say, just flat out, like inspiring vision of, how Fanon's work connects to a Pan-African vision, right? In terms of thinking, of identity, of revolutionary mindset. And this is, again, just to continue with this theme about the capacity of Fanon's work to travel. What do you think it is? Is it something about Fanon's work that allows those kinds of connections to be made? Or do you think, and I don't think that this diminishes anything about Fanon, and in fact, I think very much elevates him. Do you think it's the creativity of those different diasporic or continental writers and thinkers, their own creativity to make Fanon central or relevant to their own thinking. And I ask that, and part of what's I'm also thinking about it behind this travel, this capacity of Fanon's work to travel is, one of the things I really like about Henry Louis Gates's famous essay on Fanon is that he calls Fanon a Rorschach test. And a lot of people took that to be a negative, and maybe Skip meant that as a negative. I don't know. But I actually think, this is something like as writers, we should aspire to, right? The idea that someone can see in your work something that is formed as much by their own anticipation of the world and their needs from the world. And they see that in your text. So I'm wondering if it's Fanon having kind of a Rorschach test function, or therefore engaging the creativity of, thinkers across the Atlantic world, or do you think it is something about Fanon's own text that sort of sets the terms of that relationship?
I think that the Rorschach comment by Gates kind of presents the other side, and I think sometimes a limiting side of the view of Fanon. The other side from your earlier comment, which is, I would say, goes to answering your question. That is the question of Fanon's ontology, that I think answers the question more than the Rorschach. The Rorschach is more an epistemological question to me. But I think it's the question it's the comment, the observation you made earlier about Fanon's ontology, which has been, engaged by, several scholars. So it's not outside the question. I think it could be engaged um, from more of a revolutionary point of view than other scholars have presented it. I think yours was more revolutionary. That is a way of being a revolutionary is what you was the point you made. And I think that explains much about Fanon. And from my own experience, the late '60s, early '70s, as a student activist, and young intellectual, um, it was our search. It was it was kind of a lag in our search for, okay, we're out here doing all this stuff. How are we being about doing all this stuff that we're doing? And we went searching for ways of being. And the idea of the traveling of Fanon, the Edward Said notion of Fanon, as a text that travels, I think the ontology, Fanon's ontology, explains it more, in my view, than the Rorschach, which is, well, you can make it anything you want. Sometimes a banana is just a banana or something. But and it's interesting because in Fanon's clinical papers, he actually has a version of Rorschach test called the TAT test, which was a version. It's kind of a cousin of Rorschach, and in his use of this TAT, what is it, the apperception something test, it raised a lot of cultural problems when applied to Algerian women, where it didn't work at all. And apparently, there's a whole literature of attempts to use these TAT tests for mental health and psychotherapeutic practices in different parts of the world, including a number of them in the United States, where it just didn't work. And so people had to revise these kind of TAT slash kind of Rorschach tests because they didn't work. A version of them becomes part of the doll studies that Kenneth and Mamie Clark do for the Brown versus Board of Education test. So I think for us, it was Fanon's ontology. How does one be a revolutionary? And when you go searching for that, it usually, again, it's a lagging indicator. Usually has the action precedes the search for
Hmm.
how to be it. And so you're kind of left with a dilemma. Okay, we're doing this. How are we to do it? Bobby Seale, for instance, said he read Wretched of the Earth 6 times before he introduced it to Huey Newton for the Black Panther
Uh-huh.
Party, and they were searching. I mean, that generation of us were searching for how to be a revolutionary. The other side of that was Martin Luther King, SCLC, and nonviolence,
Hmm.
and they had what they knew they were being as nonviolent activists, militant disobedience and whatnot. But we were coming with something else. But how are we going to be that? And we went
Yeah.
searching, and that's what Fanon gave to us.
And I think, you mentioned that one of my favorite documents is I mean, it was in the Black Panther newspaper, was the Black Panther reading list, and Wretched of the
Right,
Earth is on there along with Du Bois's Black
right.
Reconstruction. Just on a personal note about that was actually published in the edition that came out on the day I was born. So every time it comes up, it says October 26th, 1968. And I'm like, okay.
Well, I always,
It's
my
funny timing.
birthday is October 16th. And so I always identify with John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry.
Oh, these are good things to associate.
Yeah, right.
So let me ask both of you in this, and I don't want to say a soundbite way, because I actually would, invite you to articulate with any kind of depth you want. But when I look at this volume and I think about it figuratively in a reader's backpack, right? And they pull it out and they read it. It's going to take them a long time. It's a hefty volume, but everybody who's listening to this ought to read the whole thing. Just fantastic collection.
Yeah.
What do you-
John, with our pamphlet, they could be it in their back pocket, but they can't do that with this one.
Yes, unless it's on their phone. So that's the PDF availability. I think is really important.
Right. That would work.
But what would you want readers to walk away from the volume thinking? And I say thinking because in the broadest sense, because sometimes it's like there's you read a book and you have your quick sort of, what they used to call like the elevator pitch, when you're on the job market in academia, it's like, what's your like 1 minute pitch about your dissertation? But I don't really mean that, like, what's the 1 minute pitch about the book, but rather the way you walk away from the book, and the way that something that is really impactful makes you walk and feel and think, and your sensibilities are all very different. So if you imagine readers walking away from this book, how do you think or want or wish or hope they move and think and feel differently? Maybe start with you, Nigel.
Oh, well, first of all, let me just get back on the Skip Gates Rorschach thing to add to Lou's point.
Okay. I didn't mean to open up everybody's anxieties about Skip Gates.
No, it's not an anxiety at all. In fact, it was because Lou talked about the TAT, the thematic apperception tests. I was thinking when he was speaking of Fanon's discussion of the dreams in his chapter on Mononi in Black Skin, White Mask, when he said sometimes the gun is just a gun, and Freud has no use for us here. So in other words, that's the Rorschach. Sometimes what Fanon says, is what Fanon says, and sometimes what Fanon says is doing. What's he doing in A Dying Colonialism, and what's he doing in The Wretched of the Earth? Especially in The Wretched of the Earth, he's not even doing psychiatry any longer. He stops doing that in 1959 in Tunis, and then becomes a full-time representative of the provisional government, Algerian provisional government. He's a full-time revolutionary. 1960, he's on that. He's taking that trip to the southwest, right, the Malian border. He's connecting with Malian revolutionaries murdered. He talks about in notebooks in 1960. He's talking in Congo. He's meeting with Lumumba. He's giving talks in Accra. He is absolutely being a revolutionary. He's talking about continental revolution. I mean, so sometimes what he is and what he's doing is exactly what he is and what he's doing. You don't need the Rorschach test to know which way the wind blows. But anyway, to talk about the book as a whole, talk about
but that's an interesting way to think about how to walk away from this differently, right? Yeah. Is the ability to see the I don't want to say the fixity, but the stability of certain Fanonian ideas and affects and imperatives, and see the way they play out in different national contexts, right? Which is different than people are adapting or adopting, elements of Fanon or their perception of Fanon.
Yeah, I mean, I that's a good point. I mean, there's certainly ways in which one could think. Fanon is also a thinker that moves and thinks. In other words, it's not like he's, what he says in Black Skin, White Masks is, I mean, he doesn't disagree with it, but he develops his thinking in different situations. He always talks about having a situational analysis. So the situational analysis he has in France in 1951-52 is quite different from the situational analysis he's writing in A Dying Colonialism in 1959. His attitude towards, it's the revolution that creates the new subjectivities, right? Women unveiled, women veiled, the threat of women in the revolution, the ways in which relations in the family are changing and so forth that he notes in that chapter. It's the revolution that creates the new, so to speak, for Fanon to talk about, not Fanon inventing, subjectivities or something, or just out of whole hog deciding that the quote unquote new man and new woman are just created out of nothing. He's actually, it's part of his experience and his analysis of what's going on. Of course, that's 60 years ago, and it isn't mappable immediately, but in a certain sense, it's that living element of what he does in his thought and the way in which he writes, the engaging way in which he writes. The fact that he always wrote orally, and Josie or other typists and so forth typed it out. That the Wretched of the Earth was typed by, he wanted the words to say something. He was an artist in a sense as a writer. And he wanted, and I think there's a certain sense, that's why that there's a certain way in which there's an attraction. And when Bobby Seale read, Wretched of the Earth 6 times, you have to read it many times. Right. Each time you come to it, there's something else going on that takes your interest, that becomes new, and it's partly part of the way in which he wants to engage the reader that makes him so contemporary continues to be contemporary in an interesting way. And the last point I want to make, sorry I'm going on, is that I also think that the psychiatry readings translated into English aren't like in a field outside of Fanon's project. They're very much engaged in this whole question of human freedom.
Sure,
I mean, that's really
absolutely.
that's what he's engaged in, and that's what he's concerned about.
Rose, what do you think? What do you imagine you would love to see a reader walk away with in terms of their transformed thinking, sensibilities, relations?
Well, I think in this particular book, one thing that, well, Nigel did extraordinary work, right? And I think uh, you don't need to read essays in order, right? I think the book is extraordinary book just for you to read and reread and understand the the connection of the book has with the different parts. I think it's going to be hard for some people in Brazil to read the book. Not just because of language, because of course people can read in English and understand what you're saying. But
Mhm.
I'm just thinking of uh, how they're going to read the book and understanding the connections of the part they have if they're not really familiar with the ideas of Fanon in terms of social movements and transformation in society. Of course, uh, the essays is a way uh, for people in general know how we can understand in a contemporary way things that Fanon thought and was engaged from his own experience. And I think I don't know about the reception of the book, and it's just a question. I don't know about the reception of the book in U.S., for example. I imagine that the reception of the book was is great, but I think the understanding and the way that the reader is going to understand those connections, maybe is going to be a kind of uh, interesting, maybe, but on the other side, a little bit difficult because of the notion that some of them they don't have about Fanon's idea as a whole.
Mhm. Lou, let me ask you, no pressure for the profundity of your comments, but as a way of wrapping up our conversation. But how do you think, given your essay, given your sense of the volume, Fanon's work, the importance of this international conversation that the book embodies? It doesn't just spark, but really embodies. What do you think in terms of the walk away? How should we walk differently after this book?
I think we should walk away with that the book um, reflects or indicates uh, an inflection point uh, in $50 word or term, the discursive field of knowledge of Fanon. I think we're in a very different place. There's so many people who have so much, have read. There have been multiple readings of Fanon. Um, it's not like we're in a space where, well, I didn't know about Fanon. It's, when Fanon is public art in Minneapolis during the whole George Floyd and other cities, when Fanon is viral on social media, and this generation, which is kind of proud of its self awareness, uh, even sometimes when it isn't so self aware, but it's proud of its self awareness. There's no
No
way
comment.
that Fanon could be viral and be in public art in places like Minneapolis without young people being very aware, being having some resonance, there
Hmm.
being some resonance of Fanon in their thinking. And so the book, to me, signals an inflection point in the reception of Fanon's ontology, if you will. I like your term. I'm running with your expression, John.
Glad I said
Yeah,
it.
and I think what people will walk away with this book is, oh my God, I didn't know about that in Brazil. Oh God, I didn't know that in Ireland. I mean, and not because they didn't know about Fanon. It's just that they didn't know fully about his reach
Mm-hmm.
in this moment. And so I think that is new. It isn't Bobby Seale saying, "Oh man, you got to check out this book, Huey." Nobody knew
Mm-hmm.
about it. By the way, the first edition by Grove Press, which was kind of a movement publisher, went through 17 printings in the first year.
That's
And,
crazy.
and it's
Wow.
crazy. And so that's not where we are. I mean, we're at, wow, I didn't know this about Fanon in Brazil and then what they're doing. That's what I think this book uh, that's what I want people to take away with, and then to explore those other places through the guidance or through the bridge that Fanon provides, and hopefully hooking up and making these
Mm-hmm.
connections internationally for an international movement that's long overdue, but I think is emerging.
I
And
have
we have to thank Nigel uh, for
absolutely.
for doing this. He's the most prolific Fanon writer in the world, and this book, and he laughs, but it's true. I
It's
track these
absolutely
things,
true.
And
so that's great.
Nigel was very fast because I remember when I was in the US in 2019, I was visiting Yukon, and Nigel came to talk to me about the book and so the organization of the book, and asked me to write the essay. So Entity was very fast, you know, because so more. I think it's more than 600 pages, right?
Yeah,
So yeah, and so it was very fast. So I
yeah,
think it was brilliant work, and of course the engage of the authors and how the book was organized and how Nigel conducted the work, and of course in some cases, in my case, the translation because we took a time to have the translation done. So yeah, I think it was very fast and with a high quality. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
and we
and
should
so
always mention his great partner Feruz at Daraja Press that
yeah,
made this happen.
yeah,
I mean, that's movement presses and whatever modality they're in, either virally or on hardcover or both, is again comes back to the technology. I mean, we just couldn't. He couldn't have done this without
yeah.
Feruz.
And how
Well,
technology are so important, right? To put the some this kind of project in in
Yeah,
in available. No?
yeah.
So yeah,
I just want to
Well,
I want to reach out to the listeners and say if anyone's interested in reviewing the book, they should get hold of Feroz at darajapress.com.
all right. I will put that in the each podcast has a details page, and I will absolutely put that in. I will also say that Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy would be more than happy to host reviews. Well, I have to say, it's been so interesting just getting, waiting for us to talk is my class last night was on race and mass incarceration. And one of the things we ended up talking about at the end of the class was how our turn is always national in terms of how do we struggle against state apparatuses of exploitation and violence. And somebody said, why don't we ever think international like, and then, they're 18, 19, 20 years old, like said, like our grandparents and great grandparents did. And, I was able to refer them to this book and say, well, here's a book about a particular thinker deployed in this international way. And I think that's where the PDF availability is so important. Even just perusing the table of contents allows anyone to see that all of these national struggles, they have international connections, and that possibility that was so vibrant and full in the late 1960s and 1970s in the United States I think this volume does a lot to remind us that these kinds of things are all possible. And so I want to say thank you to all three of you for making the time. This was really fantastic. This is time out of your day. I'm really happy that we had a chance to talk about the volume, about your particular work, about Fanon's work in general. And I'll just say, to add to what Rose and Lou said, thank you, Nigel, for the effort of putting this volume together. And know that there are a lot of people who really appreciate this, whatever it means in terms of annual reports at your college, right? It absolutely is so important for all of us as scholars. So thank you all, and take care.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care.
Oh.